Yes. So I was adding it to the documents right now, but we have a pack release where we set a release date of November 3rd for that pack 022. So we should be going into code freeze next week for that. That's all I got.
Cool. On the distribution side, I did a release of GitHub Actions this week. With the only update was a significant update to Crane. So just let us know if you see any issues registering build packs in the registry. Any lifecycle updates for release planning? Do we have anybody from implementation team? Doesn't look like it. Okay. All right. Want to talk about RFC or pull request 175?
Yeah, that's your RFC, Joe.
Which one?
Just official
build pack.
Yeah, I just wanted to put this on here because I wanted to get it done. And
yeah, it's largely my fault. I've had PTO and then a couple other things over the last like 3 weeks, maybe a month. So I kind of lost track of this. I do think it's in really good shape. I changed some things like the namespace was CNB, and I think everybody agreed to change it to buildpacks.io, so I did that. I think the one thing that's still a little unsettled is how to specify the behavior of official build packs. And I've kind of gone back and forth between an extension spec versus something else. I assume that's what you're going to bring up, Terrence.
There's that, and I think Sam's like any stack requirement, especially with removal of stacks being merged in.
Oh yeah, doesn't that just go away though? Like, isn't it just like a it doesn't have to specify anything, right?
Yeah, well, I guess that's the question, is like, what do we want to enforce? I mean, we can definitely have this stack requirement for backwards compatibility, legacy reasons, but I think even Sam's question about would we have a Linux only, like I think Emily's point of even the profile D build pack like wouldn't support Windows, but potentially you can imagine some capability we would want to either pull out or have exist that wouldn't support Linux but would just support Windows. And so do we even, like, I get the intention behind wanting this, of like you want to build things that are generically applicable and not like this is a thing just for CentOS or something, right? But yeah, I mean, I think like, is that just a guideline, like it's a should of like what our intention is versus like a hard requirement?
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with all that. If you think you can reword it, okay, I'm probably fine. I mean, I guess I'd like a little bit stronger statement than an intent, but yeah, I agree with everything you said. Like, it might not really be possible across the board. Some things will be totally portable and some things will just inherently not be. And I think even more complicated, inherently not portable, but there might be pieces of it that you want to work or
something. Cool. I will try to wordsmith something in the PR then. Yeah, and then the other question was the one you're getting at, which is the extension spec versus co-located API spec in the build pack versus whatever else, right?
Yeah, I wasn't really happy with the mushiness of a co-located API. It does mean it, like the idea would be that there would be a spec and it would be actually, I mean, I still think I disagreed with Emily on this, but like I was saying, a specification for how the build pack worked and what its API is existing in the repository with the build pack, which means it is a part of the project, but it means it's not a part of our specification repo or has any tie to it and the versioning of it.
That lives in the build pack though, right? So like,
Yeah.
Could you all elaborate on that real quick? Like, what is the context behind? I'm assuming these are the build pack APIs of which the build pack itself is defined.
Yeah, so like I think for like a profile build pack, the API would be the .profile file, right? Like the API for this build pack is you put a .profile in the workspace, and that's how you interface with that build pack. I mean, there could be other build packs where the API is a set of environment variables. There could be a build pack where the API is, you know, something in some other kind of configuration file.
Right. So when we're talking about API in this sense, we're talking about the contract for this sort of build pack and how it behaves or interacts with essentially the source code in most cases.
Yeah, source code and other things like environment variables. Yeah.
Interesting.
There was mention, I think, of ways to like one of your requirements was the detect thing of like it has to have a way to fail detection. I assume that would be part of the API as an example too, right? Like
yeah,
describing the way that you can disable this thing without people having to either reorder or whatever, right?
Yeah, and I think part of that is like also you can imagine like these utility build packs exist because we want to decouple some of this logic from the implementation or something core in the platform or the engine or whatever. And you can imagine some other implementation, some other platform wanting to implement this a different way than a build pack. Maybe they already have some machinery that they want to leverage and it's not a build pack. They would be able to implement that API essentially without using the build pack. And that's sort of the goal, is to, you know, have something that's yeah, more of a contract than just a bunch of behaviors that you have to sort of suss out what's actually happening.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around like what is the purpose of the API or the contract or anything contractual about it? Is it so that others could recreate the same build packs, or is it really just more of some sort of expectation set forth by the build pack itself?
I think it's twofold. It's one, a way for consumers of that build pack to understand how it works and be able to read and learn about what's going to happen if you do this or that, rather than just, you know, using it and finding out that way. So in some sense, it's documentation in that way, but, you know, very rigid documentation and thorough and complete. The other end of it is for people who are potentially platform implementers that want to have that same behavior, but for whatever reason don't want or need the build pack. So I mean, like if you think of .profile again, you can imagine a platform that has its own init containers or something like that, and they don't want the build pack injecting something into the image that's going to run the .profile. They would rather use their own mechanisms to source that profile, or maybe it's something else like a proc file type thing, where they don't want the entry point to be such and such. Although that might be a bad example because that's probably part of part of the contract, but maybe they want to process that proc file or that project toml processes table in a different way, and they should be able to do that and still implement that specification. And really, like, I think this makes sense when you start to think about the driver for having these build packs is that we had specified behaviors in the implementation or in the specification that we wanted to decouple implementation wise, like the actual mechanisms in the lifecycle for doing these things for the purposes of cleaning up code. But that shouldn't necessarily manifest itself as a like this is how it works. Like it has to be this way to end users.
Okay. So this might be of a side conversation altogether, but I guess taking like a very practical and recent example with CA certs, right? The thing that came up yesterday was the current CA certs build pack strategy that what is it? The Pacato project has. That doesn't necessarily work for all the cases, especially when we're talking about the Docker registry for Analyze. And so what comes to my mind is basically the new mechanism that we'll have, which is the extensions. And I am curious how we envision extensions fitting into kind of this same sort of strategy.
I don't think it would. I mean, unless I'm missing something, because as far as I know, we don't have any part of that proposal that talks about like packaging and distributing extensions as discrete things. Like they are coupled to the builder image, if I understand correctly. So in that sense, I think it's a different thing. But maybe I'm misunderstanding you. So like,
no, I think you're right, and I think this is maybe just something that I want to bring up to try to, I guess, have us think through how we would solve the CA cert situation, right? Because if extensions need to be built into builders, does essentially every organization have to rebuild the CA cert mechanism via extensions? Would we then want to provide sort of, utility extension that people could reutilize?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I could definitely see like an extension that was, because like the main thing with the CA certs is like you need root to do the thing that's expected. Is that right? So that you can scan the image and have it, and that's why you have to have an extension. But like I could imagine a lot of cases where you have an extension that does the thing that needs privileges, and that's it. And then later on, a build pack that's sort of paired with that extension does the rest of the work or something like that. And in that case, yeah, the extension is sort of part of, or the interface to the extension is sort of part of the specification of that build pack. Is that kind of what you were thinking?
I guess I didn't have like a solution in mind, right? It was more food for thought as to this use case that I think ultimately it sounds like we wouldn't be able to handle, I guess, nicely.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if we could kind of piggyback on this sort of same strategy for distributed or officially supported utility build packs with, officially supported utility extensions.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Would that be a different RFC that follows this model then? Because extensions in theory aren't build packs per se.
Yeah, and I don't want to overload the conversation, but
I think it's relevant discussion. I agree. I agree, it's probably like a later RFC, but I think it's relevant discussion. I think it's important because the important piece of it is that there's an interface to this mechanism, whether it's a utility build pack or an extension, and it's something that we want to or need for multiple personas to interface with. So like you said, like when it comes to like a CA extension, each platform or each builder provider has to do that themselves. There's just no way around that, right? And so if we want consistency, especially if there's something downstream that has expectations about what's going to be where and how it's going to work, then we want to specify that behavior, or at least I feel like if Emily was here, she would push back on me using the word specify there, but I'm trying to think of another one. Just, you know, strongly define how that works so that we can have consistency across people that are using it, people that are consuming it, people that are providing it. And I think that's very similar to the goal of having a specification, API specification for the utility build packs.
All right. So then with that in mind, right, stepping back into the previous conversation, now we're talking about defining that contract as some sort of, you know, either schema number or API number. And it sounds like the conversation is leaning towards that should be specified on a per build pack basis, as opposed to, you know, tied to the overall, you know, build pack API. Is that?
Well, I think that's the thing Emily was pushing for before she left.
The build pack API association?
The lack of
Not associating it with the build pack.
Yeah.
She did not want she did not want us to tie it to any of the version specifications in the spec repo. She did not want it to be an extension spec. And to be honest, she didn't even want it to be a specification in the build pack itself. She wanted it to be documentation only. And so that's where we, I think, compromise was that it would be a specification, but scoped only to that build pack. There would be like this stronger contract, but that stronger contract wouldn't be coupled to the spec repo, even as an extension, which I disagree with. I think if I change this today, it would be an extension spec for each of these utility build packs would be required. And I struggle to see how that's problematic because there really isn't any versioning, like those all have their own version schema. And I don't really see how it's any different than putting it with the build pack.
Yeah, I guess my comment on the RFC, which was this is a whole new net construct, but it does seem like it's just a requirement of like letting something in versus like any kind of oversight, or like you could essentially make any build pack, right? Like it's not really there's no gate behind it besides you have to do the work, whereas like an extension spec requires something to get into the spec, right? And so I guess I was trying to understand, you're basically saying if you create a build pack in that repo with that thing, like that extension API, this thing isn't really gating anything besides telling you have to do the work to do it, right? Like, I guess that's the thing I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, I think so.
And so then it's still like a judgment call on the other side of like, should this be a thing, right? Like this particular requirement is not like, I mean, if I'm understanding that properly.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I mean, I think there's always going to be a judgment call. I mean, the things these utility build packs do, although I think we said there needs to be an RFC for each one. If I don't say that, I probably should. So, I mean, it's a judgment call, but like, I think that's how these are going to get into the project is, you know, leadership of the project deciding that, yeah, that this is broadly applicable enough and warrants being a part of the project. But in that case, the gate would be the RFC, if that's
which was implicit in the extension spec, but is not implicit anymore.
That's true. That's true. If I don't say RFC in here, I should.
It does not. Which is,
Yeah, that'll be, I can add that. I think, yeah, I think that got lost because I had it would be in the spec originally.
yeah, which was implied. Okay.
Well, I'll change that at a minimum. I still think it should be an extension spec, but. Okay, I think we can wrap on this unless you have anything else. There's definitely some changes required.
I don't think, I think those were probably the main ones. Are you, I guess I didn't catch any changes you made that you're talking about. Did you, yeah. Are you
Yeah, I did that.
moving this over to BAT as well? It seems like that's the general consensus of what we want for people, the sub team that will maintain the actual build packs.
Yeah, yeah, as long as the BAT team is okay with that. Because I had proposed implementation team, right? Yeah, I'll change this to BAT if y'all are good with that. Okay, dope.
So
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think there's a pretty good opportunity for a segue here. When we talk about the spec repo and I guess your desire for it to be extensions per build pack. I think one of the things Stephen mentioned yesterday was the idea of changing the strategy in which we have the repo organized, and that's to create documents not so much per API but per component. So I don't know exactly, what the direct correlation there could be, but again, I think it's a pretty good segue to have that same thought where it seems like you're proposing a document per build pack to then also have like a document for, let's say, the life cycle, right? A document for the, I don't know, the platform, the build pack for sure, right? And then any sort of association or any sort of reference to an API number. I think that's the challenge that we would be faced with. But I don't know what everybody else's thoughts on that are.
Yeah, it probably depends on what sort of consumes that interface. Like if it really is always the end user, then that's it, right? Like I think one of the challenges we have with other things is that, like Project Tomo, well, Pack reads that, and so Pack needs to support multiple different versions, and that's where some of the complexity comes in. Whereas the build pack is I think I can't think of a case where it is something that the okay, I just thought of something. I was saying I couldn't think of a case where the platform or the lifecycle would care about the version of that spec, but where it could matter is in compatibility with like the build pack API. So that's something to think about. Like this version of this utility build pack supports these versions of the build pack spec, or is compatible with, rather, not supports.
Yeah, doesn't it, aren't the target end users of that actually like everyone? Like there's the platform who is either pulling it in or it's pulled in by default, so they have to be aware of it to some degree. So the version of that matters. There's a build pack author if you're doing like the profile or whatever thing, right? Like it has to be there, so you care about that contract and what that API is, especially if that changes over time, to be able to merge it. And then potentially the end user, if you have a way to be able to
I think
able to disable it, so then it hits everyone, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably why Emily was against having a version spec for it. And But I feel like, what's the alternative? Like, we just trust that they're gonna always work or something? Like, that doesn't seem great. Because I think there was some concern around like versioning all these things and then having to like have that complex matrix of this is supported with this, with that, but not with these. But I kind of feel like that's the boat we're in. Especially if we're going to decouple it from the core engine. So I mean, honestly, where this started was, okay, they're build packs, but they ship with the life cycle. And for me, they're still, they remain in the life cycle spec or something like that. But yeah, that's not where we're at now.
Yeah, I guess, is that a true statement even now, like that they ship with the life cycle?
Well, that
No,
like
no, that's
runs
not.
on.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that threw me off. I was like, wait, what?
That was, I mean, Emily was fine with that. I was pushing, well, I had suggested it. I'm not sure how much I care about that, but originally I intended that, like, yeah, the lifecycle distribution would include some utility build packs that it knows to run.
So I'm trying to think of, maybe we'll step back for this particular conversation on the spec repo, and I'll bring up maybe my biggest pain point, which is sort of like the branching strategy that we have for it, is very cumbersome to work with. And I know that, yeah, like both from a consumer's perspective and also from a maintainer's perspective, I've seen and have heard a lot of, oh, I have to manually go do this for you so that you can get this, to merge in properly. And so I was curious how open we would be to kind of changing that to I think something that was proposed as an alternative at the time where this was decided. And just to kind of throw it on the table right now, I think my hope or idea would be to have a sort of like a directory structure and then the different versions within that directory structure. So for instance, like distribution, right? Distribution would have an O2 directory within it, or file, right? And an O3 directory or file. And basically everything's always at main. There could be a dev version, right? The one that's currently being worked on. Basically we would still, I think the release would actually be even more simplistic, because essentially we would be tagging a very specific commit that is then still associated with that sort of spec, right? As opposed to, I guess, what it is now. Any major pushback on any of that before I start drafting something up?
I think that was my proposal that got pushed back against.
Right. And like I said, it was mentioned, but I can't recall exactly the conversation as to why we landed where we did. But I think now we've all kind of felt the pain that it's worth reevaluating.
Do you have prior art there, Javier, when you're drafting that thing, of like how other specs do it? I feel like Ben or someone was saying something about that, but I feel like what you suggest is what I've seen in the wild.
Yeah, I did at the time. I could definitely dig them back up, but there's definitely specs that have it laid out that way.
We can watch for them too. I feel like I see those on a daily basis. Just don't think about it.
All right, I guess I am curious why branching strategy doesn't work really cleanly for the spec repo, right? Like, as opposed to a code repo that has to have tests and compile and things like that, right? I would imagine that, a set of documents are amenable to branching just because they don't really need to be touched recursive. Okay.
I think it's confusing when you need to target a specific branch for a PR, and then, like, ideally it means that, oh, these changes get merged across the different branches, but in reality they don't. So you can end up like, I think that's what those PRs are now. They're like, they're targeting the wrong branch and they're pulling in a bunch of stuff. And so it's like, and the author of the PR is like, just wants to help. And their PR is like, bloated with all the stuff that's getting carried in from some other branch.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a fair point, Anthony. But I think one of the differences is that I think most software projects don't have like 5 branches or whatever for like the different specs, right? So like there's the platform branch, right, with the different versions in it, which would be fine if that was the only thing. So we'd be like on 0.7, 0.8, 0.9. But I think where it gets complicated, there's like branching strategy for every single spec, right? So it's just like distribution has a bunch of branches, platform, build pack, and then so if you're working on a thing in say like distribution, which is a real thing that's happening right now, right? You need to point it to like this new branch, but then if in between while you're working on that something gets merged into main, your thing is like now behind. And I guess it would be somewhat similar to like if you're maintaining multiple like stable versions of a piece of software, but we're essentially doing that for like however many like spec documents we have, right, of like the different tags. So we tag like platform 07, which we just was the last one, right? But then now we have a new branch for platform 08, and then there's build pack 07, which was branched like I feel like half a year ago, because we haven't spec released that, right? And then but there's been changes that's been brought in, but it has not pulled in stuff from main for 6 months, right? Because you just have to do the overhead of like keeping all those branches up to date to ensure that when a user who is not as familiar with the spec or is just trying to make a change that's like a typo fix or something, right? It's just like they have to know which one to point this stuff to, and kind of it just feels more complicated, I think, for end users. I don't know
Like the typo fix is a really good example, right? You fix that on main, but it's like, oh no, you're supposed to do it on platform 07 branch, right? Because main is completely useless for that, purpose. And then I think the like much more complex use case is any sort of restructuring that we want to do. For instance, right now, I know Dan ran into this issue where basically the thing that he needed to do cut across multiple API specs, right? He created APR, but then had to like break it up into all these different ones because again, it's a different branch for every single spec. And so as you see, like the next one that we're working on right now for distribution 3, right? Like we're changing some things from platform, for instance, right? So now there's like 2 concurrent pieces of work trying to achieve the same thing or the same goal. And that's, again, a lot more cumbersome. And you have to know that, right, as an external contributor. And that's where that pretty big hurdle comes in. That was sorry, the long-winded answer there. Yeah. So it seems like at least the people in this meeting are okay with kind of moving in that direction. So I could propose something there. I think the one thing that maybe it would have been nice to have Stephen here for is the API versus components conversation, right? So I think the way I caught this is like the base image would have its own sort of document. The run image would have its own document. The life cycle, its own document, and so forth, right? So like we talk about components as opposed to APIs. And then in my mind, the only sort of complexity or overhead is associating all these, right? Like lumping all these and say, okay, these, when we're talking about this section here, it refers to the build pack API, as opposed to where we're talking about this other part, it might refer to the platform API.
I mean, there's if you actually have the folder structure, there's ways you could branch that out though, right? Like, or not branch that out, but like distribute that where like if we, for instance, had build pack as a folder instead of a file, right? In there, you could list components. and you could have those components in both the platform folder and the build pack folder. Potentially, I don't like, maybe that's confusing, but that's one way you could do it where you don't break the kind of APIs as we find them today, but you're able to basically write them differently, right? You don't need to have one large markdown file that is a thing that is just the API, right?
Is an example of that like some of the descriptor files where the schema for that matters across different components or different APIs maybe? Or is that a different thing?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the one that initially came to my mind, although I'm not sure how accurate it is, would be the stack, right? Even though that's going away, the stack seemed like it was very much misplaced currently.
Yeah, totally. I think stack and maybe even mixins too. I know we had talked about, or at least I had talked to Emily in some conversation about like, are there some set of things that are like cross-cutting and need to just be like not an either or?
Well,
So I was gonna.
Where do you put the like Docker file extension RFC? Like how like I feel like one of the like kind of shortcomings in that RFC is there is no spec section besides it's going to change everything. But like, what is when that gets merged, you know, like,
Yeah, where does it go?
Yeah, where does it go? How you write that? Like, if someone wanted to pick up how to do that, like, it's a gargantuan task, right?
Yeah.
Is there a sense of where that's going? I would assume that's not platform, is it?
No, I don't think there is a sense of where it's going.
It's yeah.
We kind of hand waved over the specification changes, which we haven't done in the past, and I think might bite us in the end because there are going to be some tough questions like that. And even though we all agree on the big picture, that's why for like stack packs we spent an enormous amount of time, you know, fleshing out the very fine details to the point of writing the spec for it. In like, there's still a draft PR for the specification changes for stack packs before the RFC was approved. And I worry that not doing that for Dockerfile support is going to bite us.
Yeah, you weren't here yesterday during the core team sync, Joe, but I brought up like, does the extension TOML, for instance, need to be versioned? Does it need to be have an API version, which I think kind of leads into some of the spec layout stuff. But like, where does that go? There was talk about it going in build pack API, but I feel like one of the things that's weird about that is like, as a build pack author, why do I need to know anything about the extension TOML, right? Like, that's not like,
yeah, I think so.
To the API version, but
the reason, and maybe this gets back to like what I was asking about the descriptor files, is like the reason to tie that to the build pack API is that it has so much in common with it. Like the extension TOML looks almost exactly like a build pack TOML with a different table name. And I think that was the motivation for tying it to that specification version, is to keep those in line. But again, maybe it doesn't belong in the build pack API, but rather some core set of like descriptor. Like, do we need a core spec that is just those like cross-cutting artifacts or whatever?
Or would extensions be a separate API altogether, right? As opposed to build pack platform extension.
Make extension spec.
I was about to say, I think we just ran into the problem where they conflict. I wasn't sure which extension you're talking about.
So I think, so yeah, I mean, maybe that's another thing to discuss in this right now, right? It's like, what do we want to rename extensions to as extensions come in?
Well, Terrence, I think it suggested actually more explicitly naming the builder extensions. Like maybe we should call those builder extensions.
Or I think Steven suggested like image base extensions or something.
Image
Yeah,
extension.
sure. Image extensions. Yeah, that makes sense. So it might be fine. Otherwise, I mean, spec extensions is pretty arbitrary. Like we could call it spec additions, probationary specs. I don't know. I mean, there's a whole bunch of options that we can just, and it's not, that's not really part of the developer experience for build packs. So I don't really care what we name it.
Yeah, I think I'm in favor of what you just mentioned, right? Like renaming the extension spec side of things as a very quick, way out.
Yeah, I think my point in the RFC was, I think there is a conflict because we have this concept and it seems like no one else at the time, for everyone I talked to yesterday, was just like, yeah, whatever. That's never going to be a problem. And I was just like, really? Like,
Oh, I
I
don't.
thought about writing this spec. Like, I feel like it will actually be confusing in the spec if you have a thing called extension. There's a thing in spec called extension. Like,
I don't think well, I certainly didn't feel it would never be a problem. I just figured it wasn't unsolvable for all the reasons we just listed. So.
Oh, I think it's solvable, but we should solve it and not
Yeah,
ignore it.
yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at, Terrence, is maybe solve it as part of the RFC process.
Yeah,
instead of
exactly.
punting on it.
Instead of punting on it.
Yeah, that's fair.
But I mean, regardless of whatever the naming thing is, an extension for the extension, an extension spec for the extension thing. I feel like that's our actual place where we put cross-cutting things like builder and distribution. Well, I guess distribution is just a whole new spec.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think spec extensions are where we put cross-cutting things.
Yeah, I thought extensions
fact-
were to say that this wasn't mandated for you to be, CNB compliant, where it's like.
I mean, that's probably true for extension, right?
Is it?
Are we mandating platforms have to support?
No, oh yeah. No, I agree with that. I think it's, well, I think to your point, we should suss that out during the RFC process. But I think I think extensions could be an extension, or maybe optional specs, because as you said, Javier, they're like optional in terms of being CNB compliant. And I think honestly, like anything that can be optional probably should be. Like it shouldn't be a gargantuan task to re-implement lifecycle or whatever.
Because if we put it in the spec and it's not an extension, we're basically saying every platform that exists today is now an invalid CNB platform if you upgrade, right? Because you now don't support that, and that seems.
And there are definitely going to be platforms that don't want to let you do that. Like that's introducing a very different set of concerns. Yeah.
So I guess to lean on that a little bit more, does that mean that if I have a builder that has extensions, right, it essentially shouldn't work on these platforms that don't support extensions?
I think so. Because if you as a platform don't want extensions to run.
Do we have a mechanism
Well, you could also
RFC that states that?
I don't remember reading it yesterday when I reread the whole thing.
Yeah, because I think that's pretty important, right? Like, because otherwise you're going to have all these builders, right, that essentially may not work as expected, and it would be and if it's ill-defined, you're just going to get a whole bunch of pretty nasty bugs.
Well, I think what happens there, right, is the platform just wouldn't run stuff in that directory, which could be bad. or it could work fine, I guess, like, but it's probably really contingent on how mandatory those extensions are.
What is I heard the downside to making it not optional. I think from a platform's perspective, right? What are the downsides? I know I heard that basically everything currently would be non-compliant. But ultimately, that's true for any platform API change that we do, right? So
Yeah.
I don't think that that's a real deal breaker. It's
Yeah,
really, sorry, go ahead.
I guess the other downside is what happens if you are, say, an air gapped or like a really tight kind of environment that you want to have as a platform, and you don't want to allow, even if it's on the builder, right? You just don't want to allow extensions. I guess it's just you don't pull that builder in. You just don't have a builder that has extensions. That's how you solve that problem. But even to Steven's point, like his intent is the builders are an example, not the only way to leverage. Like you can just have an image that has it, or just have it somewhere, right? Like it doesn't have to, in theory, just be on a builder. You could volume mount it in, right? Builders are just a convenient mechanism, like we've been saying for a while, to couple like things into a Docker image or OCI image. I don't know, like would platforms want to disable that, opt out? Like, is it just don't use a builder that has an extension? Like,
But I think,
what
yeah, I
is the
mean,
answer there?
what is possible that this, I think there's a lot of overlap in people that don't want that and don't want custom builders. So it sort of solves itself in that sense. But as soon as you have a platform that allows custom builders, but then doesn't want extensions, maybe that case doesn't exist, you know? But the point that you're providing custom builders, like, who cares?
Yeah, because ultimately I would think one of two things: you're deferring the complexity to the builder or the builder provider to say, oh, hey, did my extensions run so I could do A, B, or C, or they didn't run so I could provide a useful error that says like, hey, I don't have what I need, right? Or you give that sort of condition to the platform, and the platform is the one that says, I support custom builders, but if they have extensions like that, you know, that's a strict no. I think at the end of the day, to me, it just means that from a spec perspective, it's optional, but maybe not in the same way that other optional implementations are. Like you have to acknowledge that they exist, and you have to say like, they're not supported on this platform.
Well, I mean, as a platform, just choose not to run those hooks, right?
Well, I would say even more so, you would say that, you know, if I was implementing the platform, right, is you have to acknowledge that they exist. And if somebody tries to run a builder with extensions, I would fail and say, this builder is not supported because we don't support extensions. And so I think this is very opinionated, but from a spec perspective, I would want to see that, right? That the spec for the platform says you have to check on extensions, and you may run those, or you may, you know, I guess you may optionally run those. I don't know exactly what the legalese.
I think you may run them.
Yeah.
It's probably the right thing versus like you must run them, where it's like not optional. I think the must would be if you choose not to run it, you must throw in error if it exists on the builder.
So it's optionality that way, not optionality through an extension spec.
Right.
Yeah. That would be my vote.
Is extension its own API?
Say that again.
Is extension its own API?
in the scenario that we just talked about, it made a lot of sense for it to be in platform. At least that portion of it,
Right.
because you know, that's kind of the area that we're looking at. I don't know about where you define the inner workings of an extension. Is that even a true thing?
Well, you have to define extension tunnel at least. And the specification around, like, there's essentially all of what build pack API does, right? You need that for the extension, which is what are the, like, how does CNB build factor, like where that environment variable comes from, the like the two arguments that get passed in, the, you know, build ID and the base image, right? Like those are defined somewhere, and they're different from the build pack API. Those don't exist in the build pack API. Yeah, the TOML file format, what that looks like if that ever changes or evolves. The bin build, bin detect, similar to the build pack API. Those need to be defined. The output, the LB, like how we, when the output gets run, like execd, it will output this thing that is going to be a Docker file that has to be defined somewhere. The fact that we won't support LB out of the gate is a thing that has to be defined, right? The only format we will support that you expect to output is Docker file. If you don't have detect, it will automatically pass, is the difference from build pack API. There's actually, like, I feel like coupling with build pack API is like somewhat dangerous because it is very similar, but it's also very different. Like it does not, it's not like a thing here or there. It's like inheritance, where it takes a thing but then replaces like a large part of it, right?
Yeah, I'm very much against you know, it being a part of build pack for that reason. I think it should be its own, and I think as I'm kind of drafting some of this stuff out, having a mention in platform, you know, of extensions and how you would call the extension, that's like a contract there. The inner workings of the extensions themselves, that's essentially a separate contract, in my mind, right? So how you would get called and so forth. But I don't know, because no, it would be the light
Do you mean
that does the
you
execution.
mean how it's consumed or invoked versus as a creator of an extension, this is my interface to everything else? Are those sort of the two things that you're talking about?
That's how I initially envisioned it, yes. But I'm still thinking through it because it's not the platform that calls extensions, right? The platform just has to, if I'm not mistaken, it's the lifecycle
Yeah.
that's going to be doing the work.
Yep. But the lifecycle does all the work for everything, right? For that sense of like, once you're on the platform, it's the thing that executes both the build packs and, well, same with the extensions.
Yeah. So I think our prior conversation about the platform caring about extensions, I'm not sure how valid that is anymore.
I think it's the same degree of like build pack, but
We're at time and I need to drop. I think, like, in summary, like, I'm very supportive of the spec repo changes that you're proposing, Javier. I feel like we could do that independent of the Dockerfile RFC, and I think we probably should figure out in the RFC for that how it fits into whatever model we have for the spec repo. Would you all agree with that? Cool.
yeah, I just don't think Steven's gonna be one that does it. So I think it will come from other folks.
Okay.
Cool.
Adios.
Thanks, everyone.